Nefertiti, the queen they erased. A man stands inside a temple at Karnak, chisel in hand. He is not a vandal. He is following orders. With slow, careful strikes, he is removing a name from the stone, not smashing it in anger, but correcting it, the way a scribe corrects a mistake on a scroll. Above him, a carved face stares out, serene, untouched for now. He moves to it next. Strike by strike, the nose disappears. Then, the eyes. Then the mouth that once belonged to one of the most powerful women who ever lived in Egypt. This was not the only wall. It happened across the kingdom, in temples 100 miles apart, in tombs, on monuments meant to last forever, over years, by order of men who came after her and needed her to have never existed. They were good at their job. For more than 3,000 years, it worked. Her name vanished from the official king lists. Her statues were smashed and buried face down in pits. Her entire city was abandoned to the desert and swallowed by sand until nobody alive remembered it had ever had a name. And yet, right now, you could probably picture her face, not because the erasure failed, because something it missed survived by accident. In a workshop nobody thought to search for over 3,000 years. Her face is one of the single most reproduced images of the ancient world, sitting behind reinforced glass in a German museum, visited by millions of people who could not tell you one fact about the woman it belongs to. They know the face. They do not know the name. That is exactly what the people who erased her wanted. Her name was Nefertiti, and long before she became a famous bust in a museum case, she was erased twice, once from history and once from her own grave, which to this day, no one has ever found. To understand why anyone would go to this much trouble to make a queen disappear, you have to go back to a kingdom that had no idea what was about to happen to it. By the time Nefertiti arrived at court as the wife of a young prince, Amenhotep IV, Egypt had been ruling itself, almost without interruption, for well over 1,000 years. It was the wealthiest state on earth, fed by tribute from conquered territory in Nubia and the Levant, and held together as much by religion as by the army. The Temple of Amun at Thebes alone controlled estates, gold mines, and farmland on a scale that rivaled the crown itself, and its priesthood had grown rich and politically untouchable across generations of pharaohs who needed their support to rule. Everyone at that court assumed the new king would do exactly what every king before him had done: keep the old gods fed, keep the priests loyal, keep the machine running quietly for another generation. He did not do that. Early in his reign, Amenhotep IV began stripping funding and authority from the old priesthoods and elevating a single god above every other deity Egypt had worshipped for 1,000 years. The Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself, depicted not as a hidden animal-headed figure in a dark sanctuary, but as a literal sun in the open sky, its rays ending in small hands that reach down to bless the royal family directly. No other god received temples. No other god received priests. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and ordered an entirely new capital built from nothing in the open desert, on land he declared sacred by royal boundary markers carved into the cliffs on either side of the Nile. He named it Akhenaten. Today, what remains of it is mostly foundations and wind-blown sand in a site modern archaeologists call Amarna. The theology itself was as radical as the politics. A surviving hymn from this period, addressed directly to the Aten, describes the sun disk as the sole source of all life on Earth, the force that makes the chick break out of its egg already alive, that fills the Nile with fish, that wakes every sleeping person each morning by touching them with light. There is no underworld god judging the dead in this worldview, no afterlife ruled by Osiris, None of the elaborate funerary machinery Egyptian religion had spent 2,000 years perfecting. There is only the sun, and the royal family who alone, according to their own propaganda, could speak to it on behalf of everyone else. That last detail mattered more than it might sound. Ordinary Egyptians, for the first time in their civilization's memory, were cut off from direct access to their own gods. Worship now had to run through the palace. That alone was reason enough for a great many powerful people to want this entire experiment to disappear the moment the family who built it lost its grip on the throne. Most retellings of this period focus almost entirely on the king. They shouldn't, because in nearly every surviving depiction of this religious revolution, there is a second figure standing at exactly the same height as the king, performing rituals that, for over 1,000 years of Egyptian tradition, only the pharaoh himself had been permitted to perform. That figure is Nefertiti. In temple reliefs from Karnak, and later from Amarna, she wears her own version of the king's crown. She is shown smiting captured enemies. A pose so tightly bound to royal and near-divine authority that it had essentially never before been granted to a queen. One surviving block shows her alone in a war chariot, without her husband beside her, in a visual tradition where royal women were almost always shown standing slightly behind, slightly smaller, slightly secondary to the king. Here, Nefertiti is the same size as Akhenaten. In several scenes, she performs the sacred offering rituals to the Aten by herself, with the king nowhere in the frame at all. This was not decoration. In a civilization obsessed with carving exact, permanent records of who held power and how much of it, scale, and posture were never accidental. They were political statements, set in stone for what the Egyptians genuinely believed would be eternity. And the statement repeated across temple after temple was unambiguous. Nefertiti was not simply a royal wife. In practice, she functioned as a co-ruler. The new capital itself reflects this. The boundary stelae that marked the edges of Akhenaten, carved early in the project, record Akhenaten swearing an oath to build his sacred city. And they name Nefertiti beside him as an essential, permanent fixture of that oath, not an afterthought. Tomb art belonging to the era shows something almost unheard of in formal Egyptian royal portraiture. The king and queen shown informally, embracing, kissing in public view, riding together in a single chariot, surrounded by their 6 daughters in scenes of obvious, unposed domestic affection. Egyptian state art before this point almost never showed royal intimacy. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are shown holding their children on their laps mid-conversation. Whatever else this revolution was, it was also a radical rewriting of what a royal family was allowed to look like in public. It came at a cost the inscriptions don't dwell on. Diplomatic letters from this exact period, sent from Egypt's vassal rulers across Canaan and Syria, what scholars now call the Amarna letters, because they were found buried at the abandoned city itself, repeatedly begged the Egyptian court for military help against rival kings and raiding forces, warning that without Egyptian troops, entire client territories will be lost. Many of those letters appear to have gone unanswered, or answered too slowly to matter. While the royal family was occupied building a city to a god barely a decade old, parts of Egypt's empire were quietly slipping away on the far side of the desert, with no record that anyone in power was paying close attention. Further north, the Hittite kingdom was steadily expanding its own influence across Syria, absorbing exactly the kind of vassal states Egypt was failing to defend. None of this appears anywhere in the religious art commissioned at Amarna. The temples and tombs show a family at the center of a perfect, sun-blessed world, untouched by the fact that several hundred miles away, that world was already starting to come apart. Historians still argue over exactly how far Nefertiti's authority went. What almost nobody seriously disputes anymore is that her own name, Neferu Aten, beautiful are the beauties of the Aten, was constructed deliberately to echo and rival the king's own throne name. You do not give a queen a name engineered to sit beside the pharaoh's own, unless you intend the world to read her as something close to his equal. And then, partway through this revolution, something happens that the historical record cannot fully explain. Nefertiti disappears from the inscriptions, not killed. There is no death scene anywhere, no funeral record, nothing dramatic carved on any surviving wall. She simply stops being shown under that name. At almost exactly the same moment, a new figure begins appearing in the royal record, using a strange doubled throne name. Enkeperur Neferneferu Aten, a name built using feminine grammatical endings in a language and a tradition where every pharaoh's formal titles had, without a single confirmed exception, always been masculine. A growing number of Egyptologists now believe these are not two different people. Some have argued instead for other candidates. A secondary wife named Kia, or her own daughter Meritaten. But the strongest current case points back to Nefertiti herself, that she did not vanish at all, but changed her title and assumed full pharaonic authority in her own name, ruling Egypt not as a queen standing beside a king, but as a king in her own right, the way Hatshepsut had done generations earlier. If that reading is correct, the most famous face of the ancient world may also have belonged to one of the only women who ever held Egypt's throne alone, even if only for a few short years before everything collapsed. There is a physical trace of this transition that survives the destruction that came later, a relief known to Egyptologists as the Corrigency Stela, originally carved to show two seated kings side by side, only for one of the two figures to be reworked, recarved, and partially recut into a different identity sometime during the period in question. Scholars disagree fiercely over exactly who that second figure became after the recutting, which is, in miniature, the entire problem with this stretch of history. The stone itself was edited in antiquity to obscure exactly the transition modern historians are now trying to reconstruct. We cannot prove this with certainty. The Amarna period is one of the most deliberately damaged stretches of Egyptian history that exists, specifically because of what happened next, which is also the reason her story is so hard to confirm. Akhenaten died. The religious revolution he built around a single sun god against the will of Egypt's oldest and wealthiest priesthoods did not survive him for long. Within a few short years, a child, the boy who would become Tutankhamun, sat on the throne, almost certainly guided by older officials working to undo everything his father had built. The old gods came back. Funding returned to the old temples. The capital moved back to Thebes, and the city of Akhenaten, built from nothing for a god that had briefly mattered to one family, was abandoned outright, stripped for its stone, and left to the desert. What happened to the people who built it was worse, and it was not random looting. It was state policy, carried out methodically over years. Akhenaten's name was hacked off monuments across Egypt, his statues smashed, and the broken pieces reused as filler stone inside the foundations of new temples built for other kings. A calculated insult, turning a former god king's image into rubble beneath someone else's building. Nefertiti's name and image suffered the identical fate, wall by wall, region by region. Thousands of small decorated blocks from Akhenaten's temples, later called Talatat, were dismantled and reused, face down, as ordinary construction material at sites like Hermopolis, hidden inside walls where no worshiper would ever see them again. Later, official king lists, the formal record of every legitimate ruler of Egypt, skipped the entire Amarna family in total silence. As far as the official memory of the civilization was concerned, for the rest of its 3,000-year history, Akhenaten and Nefertiti had simply never sat on the throne. If you have spent any time around Roman history, You already know a version of this practice by its Latin name, damnatio memoriae, the formal condemnation of someone's memory after death, carried out by erasing their name and image from public life, rather than simply burying their body. Rome would not exist as an empire for another 1,000 years when Egypt was already doing this to Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Methodically, expensively, and with far more lasting success than almost any Roman Senate ever managed against an emperor they hated. The instinct to erase a ruler you despise by attacking their image rather than their corpse is not a Roman invention. Egypt had already perfected it, on a scale most Roman damnatio campaigns never approached, more than a millennium earlier. This is what ancient erasure actually looked like. Not forgetting, but a deliberate, expensive, multi-generational campaign engineered so that no future Egyptian would ever learn these rulers had existed, because the religious experiment they built threatened too many of the institutions that came after them. It worked for over 3,000 years. Then, in December of 1912, a German excavation team led by archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt was digging through the ruins of Akhenaten, by then nothing but sand and broken foundations, and reached a building identified as the workshop of a royal sculptor named Thutmose. In a side room, beneath centuries of collapsed mud brick roofing, they found her. A painted limestone and stucco bust, just under 20 inches tall, finished with a level of craftsmanship almost nothing else from the period can match. One eye is inlaid with rock crystal and looks startlingly alive in raking light. The other eye socket was left empty, possibly unfinished, possibly missing its inlay since antiquity. Nobody has ever been able to say for certain which. Borchardt's own excavation diary from that day records, almost word for word, that description was useless, and that the piece simply had to be seen to be believed. It would go on to become one of the most recognized human faces in the history of the world, reproduced on postcards, perfume bottles, magazine covers, and museum gift shop merchandise on every inhabited continent. People who cannot name a single Egyptian pharaoh can usually recognize that face on sight. For most of the last century, almost none of them knew her name, or that the woman behind that face may once have ruled Egypt in her own right. The find was kept quiet at first. Egyptian law required excavators to report significant discoveries to the Antiquities Service, which would then decide what stayed in the country and what could legally leave with the foreign team that paid for the dig. Borchardt's team did report the bust. They had no real choice, since other objects from the same workshop were also being claimed. But the manner in which it was presented to the inspecting official, on the day the formal division of finds was decided, is exactly where the controversy begins. The bust left Egypt for Germany under a system called partage, common at the time, in which excavation finds were formally divided between the foreign expedition and the Egyptian Antiquities Authority overseeing the dig. And here the story turns uglier. According to a long-disputed but persistent account, when the Egyptian inspector arrived to review and approve what Borchardt's team would be permitted to keep, the bust was presented in a way designed to undersell it, described in the official inventory in language that downplayed its quality, reportedly photographed and displayed under deliberately poor conditions that made it look far less remarkable than it actually was. Whether this amounted to calculated deception or simply a convenient undervaluation that happened to benefit the German team, the outcome was identical. Egypt signed off on letting the piece leave the country, almost certainly without anyone involved understanding what they were actually giving away. The bust went to Berlin. It has never gone back. Once in Germany, it became something close to a national obsession. Adolf Hitler reportedly called it one of his favorite works of art in any collection, and personally blocked a proposed exchange that would have traded the bust back to Egypt in return for other antiquities, reportedly declaring he would never give it up. It survived the Second World War hidden in salt mines and underground bunkers, passed briefly through Soviet hands during the chaos of 1945, and was later split between East and West Berlin's rival collections throughout the Cold War, before eventually settling into its current home at the Neues Museum, where it remains today behind reinforced climate-controlled glass. Egypt has asked for her back, more than once, through official government channels, across different decades and different administrations, including a widely reported public demand from Egypt's own Antiquities Authority, insisting Germany had acquired the piece through deception and owed it to its country of origin. Germany has said no every time, citing the legality of the original partage paperwork, the same paperwork that, by most credible accounts, never told the Egyptian inspector what he was actually approving. This is not a uniquely Egyptian grievance. Museums across Europe still hold thousands of objects taken from former colonies and occupied territories under agreements that, examined closely, were rarely fair exchanges between equals. The Nefertiti bust has simply become the most visible single case, because almost nothing else taken under those circumstances is quite this famous, quite this recognizable, or quite this central to how the rest of the world pictures ancient Egypt in the first place. So here's where the story sits today. The most famous face of the ancient world stands on permanent display 3,000 miles from where she was unearthed, inside a country that has refused for more than a century to return her, while the actual woman behind that face is still missing. Not metaphorically missing, literally missing. No confirmed tomb, no confirmed mummy, no confirmed remains anywhere on Earth. That has not stopped people from looking, and it has not stopped them from claiming, again and again, that they are close. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed that her burial might lie behind a sealed wall inside Tutankhamun's own tomb in the Valley of the Kings, pointing to faint traces in high-resolution scans that he argued showed two hidden doorways cut into the painted plaster. Radar scans followed, then more radar scans, then years of inconclusive, contested results that satisfied almost nobody on either side of the argument, before the theory resurfaced once again in 2026 with newly cited evidence that has not yet convinced the wider field. Plenty of respected Egyptologists remain openly skeptical, some bluntly dismissing the entire idea as wishful thinking built on shadows in a scan. Separately, Egypt's most famous living archaeologist has announced, more than once over the past decade, that he is narrowing in on her location in an entirely different part of the same valley, near the tomb of Hatshepsut, with renewed claims as recently as this year that a breakthrough discovery could come soon. Neither line of investigation has produced anything close to confirmation. The hunt for her body is still active, still unresolved, and still generating headlines well over 100 years after her face resurfaced from the sand, which leaves Nefertiti in a strange, almost contradictory place in history. She is simultaneously one of the most recognized human beings who ever lived and one of the most thoroughly erased. Her enemies took her name off every wall they could reach. Time has hidden her body somewhere no one has yet managed to find. And the one piece of her that survived both campaigns, a painted face, pulled out of a forgotten workshop almost by accident, now sits in a glass case in a city she never visited, in a country that did not exist yet, more famous today than almost any king who ever actually sat on Egypt's throne. They tried to make sure no one would ever know who she was. They failed in the strangest possible way, by leaving the entire world her face, and almost nobody her story.